Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Arizona. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The desert around Ash Fork, Arizona in 1870 was no place for comfort. The land was pale and dry, its silence interrupted only by wind dragging dust through the mesquite. Travelers heading west spoke of long stretches of emptiness, of stagecoach stops that looked half abandoned, even when someone lived there. It was here, on the edge of the frontier, that two women appeared, strangers who called themselves Margaret and Ellen Burns, though even their surnames seemed borrowed. Locals remembered their arrival vividly. The sisters came from the east by wagon, with modest trunks and an air of quiet refinement rare in a settlement of miners and ranch hands. They purchased a weather-beaten boarding house on the outskirts, a structure that had once been a rest stop for cavalry patrols before the route changed. They reopened it within a week, hanging a sign that read simply, "Rooms Meals." The town's newspaper, the Prescott Courier, mentioned them only once that autumn. Two enterprising ladies now operate the old Caldera stop for travelers. The fare is plain, but respectable. No one knew then how quickly that reputation would blacken. When a local rancher disappeared in late November, few thought of the sisters. The man was known to wander and drink, but when a second man, a teamster hauling goods from Yavapai, was last seen entering their boarding house and never came out, curiosity grew into quiet talk. At that time, fear already ran deep across Arizona territory. Just a year later, the region would be shaken by what came to be called the Camp Grant Massacre, a grim event that made every isolated household wary of strangers. In that climate of suspicion, even small oddities turned to whispers. A deputy named Jonas Willard wrote in a December 1870 note, "The Burns women are polite but cold. Their boarders complain of a strange odor in the back hall, like something left too long in damp earth." Others noticed how no one ever saw deliveries of meat or provisions, though the sisters claimed to serve stew nightly. A traveler described the food as hearty, but with a taste I could not name. Still, the Burns sisters were respected enough to keep questions away, for a while. They dressed neatly, spoke little, and attended Sunday service without fail. If anyone suspected more, they held their tongues, until the thaw of spring revealed something that would not stay buried. By March of 1871, the thaw came early, softening the hard crust of desert soil that had lain frozen through the short winter. When meltwater ran down the slope behind the Burns boarding house, it carried with it a dark residue, not red, but brown-black, seeping from a narrow trench behind the root cellar. A farmhand named Thomas Creel, hired to mend the fence, noticed it first. He followed the trickle to its source and found the soil disturbed, loose in a straight line, as though something had been buried hastily. His statement to the county clerk still exists in a faded copy. The ground was neither shallow nor deep. There were stones placed on top, and under them a smell that near turned me to sickness. Creel alerted the local constable, Emery Glass, a man whose post was as much ceremonial as it was investigative. Glass rode out the next morning, spoke briefly with the sisters, and returned pale, saying only that, "The matter is settled." The townsfolk accepted his word, for a time, though none could say what had been settled. Days later, Margaret Burns shuttered the house for repairs. Ellen, the quieter of the two, was seen purchasing lime from the general store. Several sacks, more than anyone could imagine needing for household use. The clerk, Mrs. Lillian Wexler, later testified. She asked if lime would keep down smells from the well. I told her it might. She smiled just a little, the way a person does when you've answered the question they hoped you would. Around that same season, the Prescott Courier printed a notice about the Camp Grant Massacre, detailing the frontier's mounting unease. Apache raids, retaliations, and vigilantism spreading through every settlement. The story's echo reached even the smallest communities like Ash Fork, intensifying the paranoia. In such a world, it was easier to assume horrors came from without, not within. Then came the boy. 12 years old, name unrecorded in most ledgers, but mentioned in a private journal kept by Reverend Silas Moore. The child had worked odd jobs sweeping the dining room and stabling mules. One night, he vanished. Reverend Moore wrote, "The sisters said he went east to find his kin, yet his shoes remained beneath the stairs." After that entry, the Reverend's tone shifts. His sermons in March spoke of sins that wear polite faces. He stopped taking meals at the boarding house. By April, patrons had thinned. Travelers chose other stops, even if it meant sleeping rough. Margaret was seen more often in the yard, staring at the dirt behind the house as if guarding it. That month, a letter reached Yavapai County from a traveler who had stayed there the prior autumn. It spoke of odd sounds at night, as if someone walked the floor barefoot after midnight. The letter never reached print, but was archived among unclaimed correspondence. When the monsoon storms rolled in early that summer, they washed part of the back wall away, exposing what no one wanted to see. It was the first heavy storm of June 1871 that tore the facade from the old boarding house. Rain carved deep channels down the hill, loosening timber and washing away the thin crust of earth behind the kitchen. By dawn, the neighbors noticed the stench. Constable Emery Glass returned to the property, this time with 2 men from the territorial office in Prescott. Witnesses claimed the sisters watched from the upstairs window, silent as the men pried open the soft soil. The report that followed, filed but never published, described remains of 3 adult males interred without ceremony, each showing trauma consistent with blunt force. No one signed the report, but Glass. Margaret and Ellen were questioned separately in the parlor. The record of that day, preserved only as a fragment in county minutes, states, "Subjects claim the graves predated their arrival. Both appear composed, even when advised of the coroner's intention to exhume further ground." The coroner, Dr. Henry Latham, noted an odd detail. Beneath the remains lay fragments of cloth embroidered with initials T.W. Perhaps the rancher, Thomas Weller, missing since November. The sisters insisted they had no knowledge of any such man. News of the discovery spread quickly, but unevenly. The same week, the Camp Grant massacre inquiries dominated regional headlines, and so this smaller case remained confined to local gossip. In the saloon, men spoke in lowered voices of the women who fed travelers to their cellar. Reverend Moore, compelled by conscience, visited the site days later. In his diary, he described entering the house. The air was thick with lime. Ellen was kneeling by the hearth, scrubbing a pan that did not seem dirty. She greeted me kindly, asked if I might pray for her sister's nerves. Her hands trembled only once, when thunder rolled. By early July, both women were under informant. A watch. A deputy was stationed at the boarding house. The logbook of the Yavapai sheriff lists a single line under July 14th. Subjects absconded during the night, property abandoned. Inside the vacated rooms, investigators found personal effects packed but left behind. Hairpins, a travel mirror, and a small ledger listing names and dates. Many of those names matched men recorded as missing within the past year. Among them was a peculiar note. L. Price, paid in full. No one knew what that meant. The town's council ordered the building sealed. Reverend Moore argued it should be burned. The constable refused, saying evidence must be preserved. Days later, the boarding house did burn, not by order, but by accident, or perhaps by intent. The cause was never proved. Margaret and Ellen Burns were never seen again in Arizona territory, though in the months following, similar disappearances occurred near the border towns of New Mexico. A trader swore he saw 2 women traveling under the name Baines, selling medicinal tonics to mining camps. He described them as mannered and pale, like school teachers, but cold as winter light. By autumn of 1871, the ashes of the Burns boarding house had settled into dust. What remained was little more than a warped chimney and the blackened skeleton of a porch rail. Constable Glass, humiliated by the escape, left his post within the year. His final entry in the county log reads simply, "The case is unfinished. The desert keeps its own records." With the sisters gone, Ash Fork seemed eager to erase its shame. The land was sold for scrap timber, the cellar filled with stone. Yet those who worked the site claimed the lime never quite masked the odor that rose after rain. One laborer, Eli Norton, later told a journalist from the Prescott Courier, "It was a smell like the ground itself remembered what had happened." Rumors began to spread that the sisters had not fled at all, but changed names and reappeared further east. In Santa Fe, a woman matching Ellen's description reportedly opened a small apothecary. When questioned by a visiting lawman from Arizona, she laughed and said she'd never even seen the desert. But her manner, quiet, exact, her eyes pale gray, made the officer note her name twice. Meanwhile, in Yavapai County, the newly appointed coroner reopened old case files. Among them, the incomplete report tied to the Camp Grant massacre investigations. Comparing handwriting and signature styles, he remarked how similar certain notations were between the massacre's supply records and the boarding house ledgers. "It is as if," he wrote, "someone familiar with Army documentation kept their private accounts in the same precise hand." A surviving fragment of Margaret's handwriting, recovered from a half-burned envelope, contained one legible line: "Provisions ordered under new contract, 3 head, 4 men." Whether it referred to livestock or something darker was never clarified. In February 1872, Reverend Moore received a letter postmarked from Albee, Ukerka, unsigned, except for a crude symbol of 2 interlocking rings. Inside was a single sheet of music, the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." He recognized Ellen's delicate script on the title line. He placed it in his journal between the pages that described her earlier prayers. The Reverend's last sermon that year closed with a sentence no one forgot. "Some sins, friends, are not buried in the ground but walk the road beside us, dressed in Sunday clothes." As the years passed, settlers took over the charred plot, building sheds and small barns. Livestock avoided the patch of earth where the cellar once lay. Even decades later, when the railroad reached the outskirts, engineers marked the soil as unsound for anchoring posts. Old-timers said you could still smell lime when the wind shifted. Others said you could hear a faint knocking under the ground after nightfall, as if someone were still down there, still waiting for a prayer or a witness. In the spring of 1873, a U.S. Marshal named Caleb Dorrance was dispatched to follow what little trace remained of the Burns sisters. His orders were quiet, unofficial, a favor to the Prescott Sheriff's Office, which still carried the embarrassment of their escape. Dorrance was a patient man, a veteran of the frontier conflicts, and he had seen what isolation did to people. He began by traveling the post roads through Holbrook, Winslow, and on toward the New Mexico line, following fragmentary reports of 2 women selling restorative tonics and offering boarding for travelers of good moral standing. In a mining settlement called Silver Basin, he found a ledger signed E. Baines. The handwriting matched Ellen's precisely. She and her sister had rented 2 rooms behind a shuttered saloon, taking in the occasional drifter. They were last seen a week before the building burned down. Another fire, same as before. Witnesses spoke of a strange humming in the night and a wagon leaving before dawn. From there, the trail thinned. Dorrance's field notes, preserved in fragments at the Arizona Historical Society, describe a growing conviction that the sisters were part of a quiet pattern across the frontier, one that feeds on the lost and unaccounted for. He compared the timing of disappearances to census records and missing travelers from the Camp Grant era. His words were methodical, never dramatic, but they carried a kind of dread. Where the roads are empty and the names change, the same 2 shadows appear. Meanwhile, back in Ash Fork, townsfolk tried to rebuild their sense of normalcy. The boarding house ruin became a boundary marker. Children were warned not to play near it. A blacksmith's wife, Agnes Cole, kept a small garden nearby, yet every spring she claimed her crops failed on that ground. "Too much lime," the men said. She thought otherwise. "The soil refuses to grow," she told a visiting newspaperman, "as if it still remembers." By the late 1870s, both sisters had vanished completely from legal record. Only 2 more documents surfaced within the next decade: a death certificate for an Ellen Barnes in Texas, age listed as 39, and a territorial arrest warrant for Margaret Bain in Colorado, issued then quietly withdrawn. Whether they were the same women remains uncertain, though both match descriptions that had by then passed into folklore. Tall, finely dressed, hair pinned, eyes cold and steady. In 1883, the Reverend Moore died at 81, leaving behind a narrow box of sermons, letters, and that single sheet of music sent years earlier. His last note about the sisters reads, "Their story will fade, but the lesson will not, that even grace can wear the mask of civility while death takes its supper in the next room." After his passing, the boarding house ground was finally plowed over for a rail spur. Workers reported striking something metallic beneath the soil, perhaps the old stove, they said. Yet when the earth gave way, they uncovered nothing more than stone, lime, and a single rusted key. The railroad laid its track elsewhere. The ground was left untouched again. By the early 1890s, the town of Ash Fork had grown around the railway line, but avoided the tract of earth where the Burns boarding house had once stood. It was known simply as the Lot by the Hill, a patch locals fenced off without legal reason. The newer generation knew it only as a story told by elders to keep them from wandering too far after dark. In 1892, an itinerant photographer named Josiah Crane arrived in the region, taking daguerreotype portraits of settlers and rail workers. He was drawn to ruins and derelict buildings, the sort of places that still held outlines of what had been. In his surviving notes, preserved by his family, there's mention of a strange, scorched foundation east of town. He wrote, "The locals call it cursed, yet the light there falls clean and true. I may attempt a plate." He set up his camera near dusk and exposed 2 plates. One developed clearly, the chimney stump, some brittle brush, the long shadow of the hill. The second, however, came out clouded, a faint blur, as if figures had been caught in motion, though no one stood there. Crane described it later to a friend as 2 shapes, or perhaps one seen twice, women's outlines, faint as smoke. He packed up and left that night, traveling south toward Prescott, where he sold his equipment and returned east. The plates were lost after his death, though a single letter survives in which he refers to the sisters the land remembers. That same year, construction began on a telegraph line crossing the old road. While digging post holes, workers uncovered remnants of glass bottles and a tarnished brooch bearing the initials E.B. The foreman, unaware of the local legend, kept it for his wife. Within weeks, lightning struck the post nearest that spot, splitting it clean in half. The incident passed quickly into local superstition. Bad ground draws bad sky, they said. By 1895, the name Burns had become a cautionary whisper, a way to speak of the dangers of trusting too easily in strangers. The regional newspaper printed an anniversary piece about frontier crimes, briefly citing the Ash Fork case alongside the Camp Grant massacre and other tragedies that marked the violent shaping of Arizona territory. The article concluded that the sisters' tale remains unresolved, a mystery of civility masking cruelty. Through the years that followed, no definitive proof of their fate appeared. Some claimed the pair died in Mexico. Others swore they were seen boarding a train in Kansas City, elegantly dressed, as if nothing had ever passed between them and the soil of Arizona. Yet each generation added to the story. By 1900, townspeople told of soft humming heard near the hill when rain began, the same tune Reverend Moore had once mentioned, the hymn that arrived in his post long ago. "Nearer, my God, to thee." The land by the hill remains unbuilt, a small dark shape on maps where surveyors still mark the earth as unstable. Those who visit say the air feels dry, but carries the faint scent of lime after every storm. By 1903, few living souls remembered the Burns sisters firsthand. Ash Fork had transformed from a weary coach stop into a proper railway town. New saloons, a telegraph office, and a schoolhouse stood where desert emptiness once stretched unbroken. Yet the old boundary remained, a patch of coarse, uneven soil behind a sagging fence, marked on survey maps as Lot 9, unfit for construction. That spring, a geologist named Dr. Warren Clive visited the area, conducting a soil study for the railroad expansion. His field report, housed today in the Arizona Territorial Archives, mentions the spot briefly. Found traces of calcium oxide unusually concentrated in a limited area. Local accounts describe a burned structure and burials. Chemical residue suggests long-term application of lime, perhaps for preservation or concealment. Clive interviewed several elderly residents, including Agnes Cole, now well into her 70s. She still lived near the property line and remembered the sisters' quiet demeanor. They were kind, she told him, but their eyes were like mirrors. You looked into them and saw your own end, somehow. The doctor dismissed the comment as senile fancy. Yet that night, while camping near the site, he recorded in his journal hearing low voices carried by the wind, indistinct but patterned, as if two people spoke in turns. He left the next morning without completing his survey. His notes end mid-sentence. Around the same time, a historian from Prescott, Eliza Houghton, began assembling accounts of territorial crimes for a serialized newspaper feature. She devoted one chapter to what she called the boarding house mystery of Ash Fork. Houghton compared witness statements and county ledgers, noting several peculiar consistencies. The sisters always arrived after local unrest, whether Apache raids, mining disputes, or rumors tied to the Camp Grant massacre. Fires followed their departures, and always there were records of missing men. Each ledger or receipt connected to them carried near-perfect handwriting, steady and exact. Her article concluded, "Some say they were opportunists, others that they were instruments of retribution. Whatever truth lies beneath that soil, it has chosen silence as its companion." After publication, Houghton reportedly received an unsigned envelope containing a scrap of dark fabric and a pressed flower, white yarrow, a plant associated in frontier lore with mourning. Inside was a short message, written in neat, deliberate script. The soil was never meant to speak. The handwriting matched samples from Ellen Burns's known letters. The editor dismissed it as a hoax, but Houghton kept the fragment in her private collection. She refused to speak of it again until her death in 1912. The fabric was later found missing, though the letter remains. Its ink faded, but legible. By then, the story had become less a crime and more a local haunting, one that respectable citizens avoided mentioning aloud. The decade after Eliza Houghton's article brought a quiet unease back to Ash Fork. Travelers began to treat the area with mild superstition, a curiosity to mention over whiskey, never to test in daylight. The new telegraph operators avoided anchoring posts too close to the lot. Horses balked when led near it, their hooves thudding hollow against the ground as if echoing something beneath. In 1905, a schoolteacher named Clara Merton rented a small home on the outskirts, unaware of the land's reputation. Her diary, found years later among her family's papers, describes her first week in town. "I walk each morning past a patch of earth, strangely barren amid all the spring bloom. The soil there seems pale, chalky, as though bleached. A few stones mark the center. Children will not step on it." Merton's tone was clinical at first, but by midsummer her entries grew strained. June 18th. Heard voices last night. Thought them men returning from the rail yard, but the words were wrong, soft, careful, almost kind. I could not distinguish whether they came from above or below. She told no one except the town minister, Reverend Alton Ward, who advised her to leave offerings of sage if she felt uneasy, an old custom borrowed from neighboring tribes. Instead, she planted wild yarrow along the fence. "For remembrance," she wrote. 3 nights later, neighbors found her door open, lamp still burning. The bed untouched, the journal left on the table. She was never seen again. Only her shawl remained, snagged on the fence beside the lot. The county declared her a missing person, though her disappearance scarcely reached the newspapers. The official note simply read, "Merton presumed departed for Prescott by coach." Over the next few years, small events collected like dust. A laborer's collapse while surveying near the lot, the unexplained illness of 2 children who played. And too close, a mule found dead at dawn without a mark on it. Each was given its own practical reason. Together, they formed a pattern that no one cared to acknowledge. In 1909, the town council finally fenced the site with iron posts and a wooden sign reading, "Property of the railroad, no trespassing." Locals joked that the sisters had at last been given their own room. By then, Arizona was inching toward statehood, and Ash Fork prided itself on being modern. But the desert keeps memory better than people do. Every storm unearthed a trace: a shard of crockery, a button, a half-buried spoon blackened with age. No matter how often they cleared the ground, the next rain brought something back. That same year, a group of traveling photographers passed through and took panoramic shots of the town. In one image, the fenced lot is faintly visible, a dark square in the middle distance. Enlarged decades later, two small shapes appear near its edge, not clear enough to name, but standing side by side. By 1910, the legend of the Burns sisters had hardened into folklore, retold by railwaymen, school children, and drifters with different embellishments each time. Some swore the sisters poisoned their guests for inheritance deeds. Others said they practiced death medicine, preserving the bodies beneath lime for unknown purposes. Yet when the railroad company filed for expansion, its legal survey still listed the fenced ground as Lot 9, contaminated or unstable. No one volunteered to dig deeper. That same year, Professor Lionel Greaves, an antiquarian from Tucson, began documenting forgotten frontier crimes for an academic volume. His correspondence with the Territorial Library mentions Ash Fork as a noteworthy site of moral panic. Greaves was skeptical of ghost stories, preferring ledger facts and coroner reports. He visited in July, interviewing what few elderly residents remained, including the widowed Agnes Cole, now nearly blind. Her recollection was halting, but one phrase stood out in Greaves's notes: "They never left, sir. They only stepped aside." Greaves took soil samples, measured the lot's dimensions, and even arranged for a shallow excavation with permission from the council. On the third day of digging, his hired men uncovered something unexpected: not bones, but a layer of scorched planks arranged in a deliberate grid, beneath which lay a rusted iron latch. When pried open, it revealed a narrow cavity no larger than a coffin. Inside were two objects: a pocket watch and a fragment of glass plate, the kind used for daguerreotype photographs. Greaves described the image faintly visible on the plate. Two women, standing apart, both looking straight into the lens. Background indeterminate. One hand of the figure on the right seems raised, as if in warning. He shipped the items to Tucson for preservation, but never published his findings. His letters stopped abruptly in October. The university received a final envelope containing only a single line written in his tidy hand: "Some subjects are better left to the desert." The photograph and watch were never catalogued. Meanwhile, Arizona's newspapers were filled with reports of drought and mining disputes. The world had moved on. Yet among small settlements, the sisters' name lingered as shorthand for something quietly wicked. Mothers warned daughters about Burns' manners, smiling without showing warmth, speaking little while thinking much. In December 1910, a passing journalist described the old fenced lot as a scar on the land. He noted the air there carried a faint metallic tang, neither pleasant nor foul, just different, like rain on a headstone. By the time Arizona achieved statehood 2 years later, the case had dissolved into rumor, surviving only in sermons, campfire tales, and one incomplete entry in the Yavapai archives labeled "Unknown Women, 1871, Presumed Deceased." Even so, travelers still reported odd phenomena. A mail carrier riding the night route claimed to hear quiet footsteps pacing beside his horse whenever he passed that way. He told no one officially, but his replacement later wrote of the same thing. As if two women walked abreast, keeping the same stride, waiting for someone to speak their names again. By 1913, Arizona was no longer a territory, but a young state, eager to cast off its lawless past. Ash Fork grew modestly: new rail lines, a post office, families settling in. Yet despite progress, the patch of land east of town remained fenced and unused, as if its silence had earned legal standing. That year, the regional newspaper ran a feature on "Vanished Women of the Frontier." The article revisited the Burns case briefly, citing archival notes from Constable Emery Glass and Reverend Moore's journal. It drew a few curious visitors, amateur historians and photographers looking to capture relics of the story. Among them was Harlan Vick, a former telegraph engineer who had taken to documenting abandoned settlements. Vick's surviving log describes arriving in Ash Fork during a windstorm. The air was red with dust, no birdsong. The locals warned against crossing the fence line. I did so anyway, for the ground seemed ordinary enough. He photographed the fenced area from several angles. When the plates were developed weeks later in Prescott, one image appeared normal, but another showed what he described as a faint smoke column shape, with two lighter forms inside, indistinct yet aligned like figures standing together. Vick mailed copies to the state university and planned to return for further investigation. He never did. On his way back from a commission near Flagstaff, his wagon overturned in a gully. The plates were shattered, the camera destroyed. His notebook ended with a final line underlined twice. The glass remembers what we forget. The phrase caught the attention of a folklorist named Sarah Leland, who included it in her 1915 anthology, Frontier Phantoms and Echoes. Leland treated the sisters' story as allegory, symbols of guilt and secrecy that the frontier buried beneath its dust. Yet even she admitted in her notes that certain records, particularly those tied to the Camp Grant era, suggest more deliberate patterns than mere myth. As the decades turned, Ash Fork's population thinned again. Fires and floods erased many of the oldest structures. Still, the lot remained untouched. Travelers reported the fence posts rusting away, yet never falling. Railroad workers claimed the telegraph line would crackle there even when disconnected from power. Local lore grew quieter but darker. Some said the sisters' ledger had once listed 30 names, 30 nights. Others whispered that each time the ground was broken for progress, whether to dig, to pave, or to survey, the same two shadows reappeared in the dust, patient, almost polite. In 1917, a minor earthquake struck the region, shaking loose foundations but doing little damage. Yet the next morning, townsfolk noticed the soil of the fence plot had sunk several inches, leaving a shallow depression shaped like two adjoining graves. No one filled it. By then, only the oldest residents remembered their names. To the younger generation, they were simply the sisters by the hill, figures out of an old cautionary rhyme. 2 hands of dust, 2 faces still, they wait where the moon forgets the hill. And so, even as modernity arrived, wires, automobiles, and paved roads, the earth there stayed hollow, its story unfinished. By the winter of 1918, Ash Fork was quieter than it had been in years. War and influenza had drawn people away or buried them in shallow desert cemeteries. The lot by the hill survived untouched, fenced still, its rusted sign half fallen. Few remembered why the ground was left alone. It was habit now, not fear, a space no one needed. During that harsh winter, a Red Cross volunteer named Evelyn Pike came to the region to deliver medical supplies. She kept a small diary, brief and factual, but her December entry stands apart. Camped by a strange fenced patch outside Ash Fork, the soil seems paler than the rest, white dust that clings to my shoes, felt watched while boiling coffee, not by men, but by something that waits politely to be spoken to. She mentioned the local postmaster, who told her it was an old grave or something worse, and advised she move her tent. She did. The next morning she found her supplies rearranged. Nothing missing, only the bandages folded neatly, and the coffee pot scrubbed clean. She thought it an act of kindness until she saw the ground around her prints, smaller footprints, 2 sets, side by side, leading back toward the lot. When she reached Prescott weeks later, Pike told her story to a chaplain, who wrote it down in a letter to his brother, a historian. That letter, preserved in private correspondence, is the last first-hand mention of the sisters before the century turned. After statehood, the county records were consolidated and the old Yavapai archives were moved. Somewhere in that process, the original boarding house file disappeared. Only references remain. Citations in ledgers, partial police notes, the Reverend's diary, and the coroner's early report. Without context, they appear as scattered curiosities. By 1920, the lot had become part of a land dispute between the railroad and a mining company. Neither side wanted responsibility for it. The official appraisal described the soil as chemically compromised, an echo of Dr. Warren Clive's earlier findings. The report noted an unidentifiable mineral residue resembling calcium oxide. To locals, that was simply the same lime that had covered the past. In one appendix, a clerk added a line that reads like an epitaph. Lot 9. History indeterminate, boundaries unstable, unsuitable for habitation. Even then, there were those who swore that on still nights, especially after storms, a faint humming rose from the fenced ground. The tune changed little from how Reverend Moore had written it decades earlier. Scholars like Professor Lionel Greaves and folklorist Sarah Leland had long since died, their papers scattered, but new archivists occasionally rediscovered fragments. Each found the same pattern: careful handwriting, missing dates, stories repeated in identical phrasing by witnesses who had never met. Whether fact, fiction, or something between, the record remained unburied, quiet, persistent, like the desert wind that passes through the old fence rails and sounds for a heartbeat, almost human. In 1921, Arizona entered an age of gradual modernization, paved roads, electric street lamps, telephones. But Ash Fork lingered behind. It was a town that had learned not to disturb what lay still. Yet progress has a way of uncovering what silence prefers to keep. That summer, the Union Copper Company surveyed land east of town, intending to purchase acreage for a small refinery. Among the plots considered was the long-forgotten Lot 9. The engineer in charge, Daniel Keene, dismissed the old warnings as backwoods myth. His crew dismantled the fence and began testing the soil for structural soundness. They didn't get far. Within days, 3 laborers quit, claiming headaches and nosebleeds after working near the center of the plot. Keene recorded the symptoms but continued operations. On the 4th day, the steam drill struck something hollow. The sound carried through the dry ground, sharp, metallic, then muffled, as if echoing through a chamber. When they dug further, they uncovered a rectangular vault made of charred wood and iron straps. Inside lay only ash, lime, and fragments of bone too fine for identification. Keene's report, filed with the company, describes the discovery plainly. Remnants suggest human material but long decayed. Vault appears intentionally constructed, possibly post-fire interment. No markers. Advised reburial. The town sheriff attended briefly, took notes, and ordered the pit sealed. That evening a windstorm blew through, scattering the lime and ash across the site. The next morning, the ground looked untouched again. The refinery project was canceled without explanation. Weeks later, Keene wrote a private letter to his wife, which survives in family papers. It's strange. The men say they heard humming while they worked, the same melody at once cheerful and sad. I told them it was the wind in the drill shaft, but the tune was too even, almost like a lullaby. After that season, no further industrial plans touched the property. It reverted to county ownership, marked once again as unsuitable for development. The locals rebuilt the fence, this time with barbed wire, and the story fell back into slumber. Old-timers began to say the land had its own patience. It waded through drought, through railroad abandonment, through changing borders, and the vanishing of those who had once remembered its name. By 1925, the hill itself had begun to erode, exposing the outline of what might once have been the boarding house foundation, a faint rectangle of darker earth beneath the dust. Travelers passing through at dusk sometimes paused, unsure why the sight unsettled them. The shape was ordinary, yet it carried a presence, a suggestion that something still occupied the space between ruin and memory. In one surviving travel journal from that year, a woman from Flagstaff wrote, "We stopped near Ash Fork for water. I saw 2 figures by the hill, women dressed in old clothes, looking out toward the tracks. When I blinked, they were gone. My husband said it was dust, but the air was still. And so, the ground kept its silence once more, watched by no one but the wind and the stars that flickered faintly over the desert's endless dark. By 1927, Ash Fork was a place travelers passed through rather than to. The railroad had shifted its main route, and the younger generation left for the cities. The old tales lingered mostly in whispers exchanged at the general store or around the potbelly stove during cold evenings. Children dared one another to approach the fenced ground, toss a pebble over, and listen for a sound in return. Most heard only wind. A few swore something caught the stone halfway down. That same year, a young anthropologist from Tempe, Dr. Raymond Alcott, began cataloging local folklore for a state university project. He traveled by rail, notebook always at his side, collecting unverified events of the frontier. When he reached Ash Fork, townsfolk pointed him toward the hill and told him of the Butcher Sisters. He wrote the phrase carefully, asking for spellings, dates, anything tangible. His first impression of the site was indifferent. A mere depression in the soil, he wrote. No artifacts, no vegetation. The smell of gypsum or lime faintly persists. But as he reviewed earlier records, those of Constable Glass, Reverend Moore, and the coroner, his tone shifted. Each account seemed precise, factual, and written by men not given to imagination. The consistency of detail, he noted, suggests something systematic, though no formal charges were ever made. Alcott's last entry before leaving Ash Fork reads, "I stood at the fence as dusk came. For a moment the air grew still, as though sound had been drawn away. 2 birds passed overhead, their shadows long. Beneath their wings the ground appeared to ripple, not visually, but in the sense that it breathed." When he returned to Tempe, Alcott presented his findings to colleagues. The faculty praised his thoroughness, but advised against including the Burns case in his publication, citing local sensitivities. He agreed. A few months later, his research assistant received an envelope in Alcott's hand containing a torn page from Reverend Moore's journal and a note. "Every record is a mirror. Some faces look back." After that, Alcott's correspondence stopped. He accepted a teaching post in California and never revisited the subject. Meanwhile, Ash Fork entered its quietest decade. With the Great Depression approaching, the town's remaining residents clung to what little the rail and highway brought. The boarded windows of old shops reflected a thin desert sun, and the lot by the hill became an accidental landmark for surveyors, a point to triangulate maps by. Yet it was not forgotten. A telegraph operator working nights claimed that every few weeks his line would pulse with faint static forming rhythmic intervals. 6 beats, pause, then 6 again. When he tapped the key to reply, the signal ceased, replaced by a faint hum through the wires. He wrote in his log, "Might be interference from weather or memory." By the century's end, the lot would outlast every witness. But in the late 1920s, as the last of the frontier's generation slipped into memory, people began to say the sisters had finally found peace. Others said peace was never the point. By 1929, the Arizona desert had taken back most of what the settlers built. Dust drifted through collapsed porches, and the wind hummed in old telegraph wires, like a voice half-remembered. In Ash Fork, the population barely reached 200, mostly rail workers and their families. Yet the fenced ground remained untouched, a fragile rectangle of history that refused to erode completely. That autumn, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Dade stopped in town during his westward circuit. He had a fondness for local lore and believed that lost souls could be soothed through prayer at the sight of their unrest. The townsfolk, weary but polite, told him the story of the Burns sisters. Dade decided to hold a brief service at the fence line, inviting anyone willing to attend. Only 6 came, an elderly widow, 2 children, and 3 laborers. As the Reverend began reading from Psalms, the wind died down. The air grew unnaturally still, the kind of silence that feels shaped rather than empty. His words faltered, and the group later claimed the ground inside the fence began to darken, as though moisture were seeping upward from beneath. The Reverend finished quickly, That night, lightning struck the iron post nearest where he had stood. It melted into a blackened twist. The next morning, the widow told the others that her dreams were filled with two women standing side by side, hands clasped before them, their eyes fixed not on her, but on the horizon behind. Within weeks, the preacher moved on, leaving behind a note in the church ledger. The hill holds its own congregation. Around this time, the Arizona Historical Review printed a small article referencing the unresolved mystery of the Butcher Sisters of Ash Fork. The author, an anonymous contributor believed to be a student of Dr. Raymond Alcott, connected their story once more to the broader turbulence of the Camp Grant massacre era, arguing that violence on the frontier had blurred moral lines for everyone who lived through it. He ended with a chilling speculation. Perhaps the sisters were merely the desert's reflection of the age, a polished surface showing the face of its own cruelty. The piece went largely unnoticed, buried among essays on mining and settlement. Still, one copy reached a librarian in Prescott who sent a clipping to Ash Fork's post office with a note. For your local files, you may wish to remember what the land prefers to forget. By the early 1930s, the town's new generation barely recognized the name Burns. But old families did. They still kept their children from wandering east at sundown. Those who ignored the advice sometimes returned pale, claiming the air near the hill seemed to hum faintly, like breath moving through a hymn. And when a new fence was built around the property in 1931, workers found their tools misplaced each morning. Not stolen, just neatly arranged in pairs. The foreman recorded it in his notebook with understated irritation. Twice as much care as we need, and not a man to thank for it. By 1932, the Great Depression had stripped Arizona of its restless optimism. Rail traffic slowed, mines closed, and many frontier towns faded into near silence. Ash Fork endured, stubborn and small, anchored by memory more than economy. The hill, fenced and avoided, stood like a monument to what the land refused to release. That spring, a Works Progress Administration survey crew arrived to map the region for a new highway. Among them was Eleanor Dorrance, granddaughter of the old U.S. Marshal who had once hunted the Burns sisters. She was young, ambitious, and skeptical of superstition. In a letter to a colleague, she joked, "I've been sent to measure ghosts." Her field notes described the location as she found it. Ground barren, compacted, fence in poor condition, no structural remnants visible. Locals call it the Sisters' Hill, but refuse to explain further. An old man warned me not to stay past dusk, said they like visitors who don't talk much. She laughed it off at first, but after a week of surveying, her tone changed. April 9th. I've worked this soil 4 days. Every night, I hear something shift beneath it. Not movement exactly, more like breathing through packed dust. My compass stutters within the fence line, needle wavering as though drawn by something magnetic. She documented no measurable anomaly, yet she avoided the site afterward. Still, the entry caught the attention of a state archivist years later, who noted how closely Eleanor's handwriting mirrored the old ledgers kept by the sisters. Same narrow slope, same precision. The survey was completed, and the highway route shifted several miles south, officially due to unstable terrain. Privately, Eleanor wrote to her supervisor, "I'm glad of it. The ground there feels full, not of stone, but of waiting." In 1935, an historian in Prescott uncovered a box of county documents mislabeled Camp Grant accounts. Inside were the Burns case notes, long thought destroyed. Among them was Constable Glass's unsigned confession. "I knew what they were, but I let them go. The territory was already soaked in blood. What difference would 2 more ghosts make?" The historian published nothing, but placed the papers back in storage. When archivists searched for them later, the box was missing again. By the late 1930s, Ash Fork's lot by the hill had passed into official obscurity. County maps labeled it only as Survey Exclusion Zone. Yet travelers still spoke of an odd serenity there, an absence of sound that bordered on reverence. Some said the air carried the faint perfume of soap and stew, as if a kitchen long closed still exhaled its final warmth. One drifter who camped near the fence wrote in chalk on a railway shed before leaving, "They weren't cruel, they were careful." The words stayed until rain washed them away, but only after a week of windless calm, as if the desert itself had paused to read them. By the early 1940s, the Second World War drew the young away from Ash Fork, leaving behind the old, the stubborn, and the stories. The town shrank to little more than a rail siding and a gas stop on the highway. The fenced hill remained, its wire sagging but intact, the soil within lighter than the rest. A patch of pale memory in a land that forgot almost everything else. A new resident, Dr. Harold Quinn, a physician retired from the Army, purchased land nearby. He sought quiet and clean air for his lungs, never knowing the history of his new home. His first journal entries are cheerful, filled with notes about the desert's beauty. But by autumn, the tone shifted. The neighbors speak of the sisters as though they were a wind that passes. I've seen nothing unusual, save for the way dogs refuse to cross that patch. My own hound whines and digs at the door whenever I walk near it. Dr. Quinn was a rational man. He decided to investigate, perhaps to lay the myth to rest. On October 12, 1941, he carried a lantern and his field kit to the fence line. In his notes, later found in a trunk after his death, he recorded what happened. Dug 6 inches into the topsoil, fine, pale, chalky. At 10 inches, the spade struck wood. The fragment appeared old but intact, possibly part of flooring. Heard what I believed to be wind moving through cavities underground, yet the air was still. Lantern flickered, no draft present. I stopped digging, felt watched. He sealed the hole and never mentioned the incident again. Within a month, he sold his property and moved to Prescott. Locals said he'd grown nervous, though he lived another 20 years, never speaking of that night. World events swallowed small-town mysteries. War, rationing, and the pace of modern life left little room for old legends. But the people who remained in Ash Fork, a few ranchers, a postmaster, and a gas-attendant, continued to avoid the hill after sunset. A single warped sign hung from the fence. No trespassing. County land. No one remembered when it had been placed there. In 1947, a road crew widening the highway unearthed a handful of relics near the property's edge. A porcelain button, the hinge of a trunk, and a rusted kitchen ladle. Nothing remarkable. Yet every worker insisted the ground beneath felt soft, like breath pushing back. The foreman ordered the dig redirected a few yards west. That winter, a traveling photographer stopped for fuel and captured the first modern image of the site. A flat stretch of earth bordered by brittle mesquite, the remnants of fence posts catching the last light of dusk. When the photograph developed, faint double shadows stretched across the soil, parallel and upright, though the frame showed no living person. He scribbled on the back before mailing it to a friend. Ash Fork, Arizona. They say the sisters still keep watch. The photo survives in private collection, edges curled, its surface flecked with dust, as if the desert itself left its signature behind. By the 1950s, Ash Fork had nearly vanished from state maps, a forgotten pocket on the old Route West. Freight trains roared past without slowing, and tourists rarely stopped except to fill their tanks. The boarded windows of the few remaining homes faced the same direction, away from the fenced hill that everyone pretended wasn't there. In 1953, a small team from the Arizona Historical Society arrived to collect oral histories of early settlements. Their lead archivist, Martha Kell, was known for her pragmatic skepticism. She dismissed ghost stories as the afterlife of bad record-keeping. Yet something about the Ash Fork file intrigued her, the overlapping testimonies, the consistent dates, the missing artifacts. She spent 2 weeks interviewing the last living residents who had heard the story firsthand. From the elderly postmaster, she recorded, "They came from nowhere, them Burns girls. Never saw a wagon before or after. One of 'em smiled at me once, polite, like you'd nod to a stranger you already knew." Kell noted how every account circled the same imagery, lime, silence, and music on the wind. She called it collective invention through repetition. Still, before leaving, she insisted on seeing the ground herself. Her field notebook captures her first and last impression. The fence is rusted but firm. Inside, nothing grows taller than a boot heel. I felt warmth underfoot, though the day was cool. A sound, perhaps the wire in the wind, wavered low and steady. The tune resembled an old hymn I cannot quite name. After returning to Phoenix, Kell organized her notes into an unpublished paper titled The Butcher Sisters and the Persistence of Local Memory. In the final paragraph, she broke her usual academic restraint. History depends on the living to remember, yet certain places seem capable of remembering themselves. This hill near Ash Fork holds its story too. Was he way a scar holds heat, not for punishment, but for permanence. She died 3 years later, and her manuscript was never formally archived. By then, highways replaced railways as the arteries of travel, and new asphalt curved around the old hill, leaving it stranded between lanes like an island of another century. Truckers passing at night sometimes reported seeing 2 figures near the embankment, motionless, reflecting their headlights for a blink before vanishing into the dust. In 1959, a journalist for a Tucson magazine stopped to photograph the spot for an article on Arizona's ghost towns. He camped overnight and later wrote, "I woke near dawn to the faint smell of soap and something sweet, like stew simmering far away. The air felt heavy but calm, and I thought I heard humming. Maybe my own nerves. Still, I packed early." When his photographs were developed, one frame showed the hill clearly under morning light, and in the far right corner, 2 slim silhouettes, identical in posture, facing the horizon. He filed the image under unexplained exposure and left it out of the article. By decade's end, only the highway remained alive, carving its bright noise past a silence that no longer needed witnesses. By the early 1960s, Ash Fork was little more than a scatter of timbers and dust, a faint mark on Arizona's long road west. Travelers drove past without knowing that just beyond the curve of Highway 66 lay the fenced rise that had once been the boarding house ground. Its story, if remembered at all, lived only in the margins of old university notes, unlabeled photos, and the few locals who still claimed the desert could hum when the weather turned. In 1961, a state maintenance crew repairing guardrails near the embankment reported a peculiar echo. When their machinery struck the ground, the vibration returned twice, soft, delayed, like sound traveling through hollow wood. They laughed it off as "old grave sighing," a phrase one of them later repeated during an interview for a regional radio program. The comment reignited local curiosity for a brief season. A few curious listeners drove out to see the hill. They found nothing but the skeletal fence, rattling faintly even when there was no wind. The following year, a historian compiling the Frontier Crimes Atlas of the American Southwest rediscovered Reverend Moore's diary in a private collection. Its last page, now fragile and yellowed, carried a simple closing line beneath the date 1883. "If forgiveness lives, it is not in this soil, but perhaps in the silence that watches over it." The historian included that quotation in his preface, but omitted the sisters' names, fearing it would make the volume too personal, too uncertain. Still, a footnote credits the town of Ash Fork as a place of unburied stories. As the century advanced, modern records forgot them entirely. Maps were redrawn, the hill was absorbed into a strip of government land, unnamed and unvisited. Only satellite photos decades later revealed an odd discoloration, a faint rectangular shadow, visible after heavy rain, exactly where the boarding house they once stood. Local folklore survived through small, persistent details. Truckers still spoke of headlights catching figures near the curve. Desert campers swore they heard humming after storms, the same old hymn that had drifted through the years. "Nearer, my God, to thee." Some said it came from beneath the ground. Others insisted it was carried by the wind over limestone, a trick of acoustics. But every few years, someone would stop long enough to notice something ordinary, yet wrong. 2 sets of prints in the dust, side by side, leading to the fence and ending abruptly at the gate. No entry marks, no exit, just the faint suggestion of visitors the desert had never managed to bury. And so, the story of the burned Sisters of Ash Fork remains unresolved, part record, part folklore, a whisper in the Arizona wind. Their boarding house burned, their names erased, yet the hill endures. When the sun sets over that land, the earth cools slowly, holding the day's heat like a secret. The fence creaks, the dust settles, and for a brief moment the silence deepens, as if two unseen women still stand there, patient as the desert itself, waiting for the world to remember what it chose to forget.